Welcome to the Wayland Library, and thank you for joining us this evening, both in person and online. Before we begin tonight's program, we want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples on whose traditional homelands we live, work, and gather: the Massachusett, the Nipmuc, the Wampanoag, and the Pawtucket. We seek to understand, acknowledge, and remember the painful ongoing history of war, genocide, and forced removal of Indigenous peoples by European settlers. And we offer a living celebration of the Indigenous peoples who continue to live and make new history here today. May we all commit to deepening our relationships with Indigenous communities and to being their allies in working for justice. Tonight, we are excited to have David Detmold here with us to help us take a closer look at the Massachusetts flag and seal in anticipation of a town meeting resolution vote, which is on Monday, May 13th. Unfortunately, Faries Gray couldn't be here tonight, but I think David will bring his voice, try to. Let's see, David Detmold is the coordinator of ChangeTheMassFlag.com. He's worked with volunteers in 90 cities and towns to bring resolutions of support for changing the flag and seal of Massachusetts to town meetings and city councils from the Berkshires to Cape Cod. David is the founding editor of the independent weekly newspaper, The Montague Reporter, and served for 20 years as an elected town meeting member in Montague. Two quick notes: if you're joining us on Zoom, put your questions in the chat at any point, and I will raise my hand and share them out loud. When we get to the Q&A, I think David's going to speak for a little while, and then we'll do a Q&A. Also note that we are recording this program for broadcast on Waycam, our local cable access station, so you'll be able to rewatch and share. It will also be on our YouTube page. Your voice will be recorded if you speak up, but I'm only recording David's face. So without further ado, I'll hand it over.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Thank you all for coming out on a beautiful spring evening to talk about this history here that we will review, the history of the flag and seal, and keeping in mind that your town, like many other towns across the Commonwealth, are being invited through a citizen's petition, I believe, to take part in a historic review of this symbol, which for 140 years has not changed, but which the state government has been looking at very carefully now for the last few years because of concerns brought not only by Native leaders. I'm very sorry Faries Gray is not here to speak for the Massachusett Tribe of Ponkapoag, which is certainly one of the tribal nations upon whose land we are standing today. But I'll try to bring his voice into this conversation. Certainly Native leaders have been protesting the continued use of their imagery in our state flag and seal for more than 50 years. And we're going to look at perhaps some of the very good reasons why that is offensive to Native people in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But also it is a grassroots effort at the city and town level, city council and town meeting level, that has really brought this issue to the forefront in the last 8 or 9 years, I would say. And Wayland's vote coming up on Monday, May 13th is going to be a very important part of that. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself. And thank you for the great introduction, Courtney, but why I came to this work. As Courtney mentioned, I started an independent newspaper in Montague, where I live, right about the time that weekly newspapers were shutting down all across the country. It wasn't a great business move, but it was a sort of a necessary step to take in a town that really was lacking its own voice in local media at that time. And as editor, yes. As editor of the Montague Reporter, one of the first things I wrote about when we only had about 60 subscribers, the paper is still doing great, by the way, despite my editorializing on the subject of the fact that our local high school was named after a man named Captain William Turner, who came to our area on May 19th. 1676, during what we consider to be the bloodiest per capita war that America has ever seen on its soil, which we call King Philip's War or Metacom's Rebellion. And toward the end of that conflict in what is now Massachusetts, a Baptist minister who had been kept in jail in Boston because of his faith was conditionally released. His name was William Turner, on the grounds that he was willing to raise a militia in the Connecticut River Valley, where I live, and assail a refugee community, which was made up largely of elderly men, women, and children, with no armed protectors right there on the site when he arrived. So he raised a local militia and attacked this refugee community across the river from where I live on May 19th at dawn, 1676, and succeeded in killing or driving into the falls, the very treacherous river waterfalls there. The name in native languages has always been the Great Falls, killing 300 to 400 refugee elderly men, women, and children, undefended and without losing a single one of his men during that initial onslaught, except one who fell to friendly fire. So in this town where I live, Montague, with this history, we've named our regional high school after Captain William Turner. And we named for nearly a century the sports teams, the Indians, which I felt compelled as an editor of a brand new weekly to inveigh against, because it just seemed to me that when you've named the school after someone who showed up on one day and killed every Indigenous person he could find at a dawn and surprise massacre, it's the height of insult or rubbing salt into terrible old wounds to then name the sports teams the Indians in a school named for the person who killed them all. So I brought that up, and we lost several of the 60 subscribers, and yet the paper continued. And on one of the anniversaries of that slaughter, I went in with about 7 other friends from town, foolishly thinking that we could bring this up to the school committee, who are there to guarantee, equality in education for everyone who goes to the regional school. And we normally have at least 2, according to the census, Indigenous students at any given point in time. And it just seemed that the school committee should look at this as a matter of fairness in education and remove this native mascot. And it created a huge furor, as you can imagine. And we had everyone from the police chief in Montague to thousands of white alumni who had worn the jersey with a Plains Indian headdress, profile, native image. And the police chief stood up at one meeting and said, "We're the real Indians." Well, meanwhile, we had invited native leaders from the tribal nations in the area, and they were there saying, "No, you're not the real Indians. And in fact, this is not an honor to us. You have your own heroes, perhaps, and you should honor them. But for us to be stereotyped in this fashion, as if all of us wore eagle feathers, headdresses like they do on, in some nations like the Lakota, this is not what our tribal headgear looked like. And if you really want to know about us, invite us into your classrooms and we will teach your children what our values and what our history and what our living culture is all about." So that debate went on for about a year. It was a very emotional debate. And in the middle of one of those huge forums that were held at the high school, as if we had nothing better to do. I understand a lot of people think symbols are not as important as many other things that our children are learning about and come in contact with. And yet once the conversation is joined, you kind of have to see it through. And we did. And in the midst of one of those large forums, I remember
alumnus standing up and saying, if we have to change our mascot, why shouldn't the state have to change theirs? And they pointed out that the flag, which had been standing there furled in shame on the side of the stage, the Massachusetts flag, was indeed like another native mascot for a conquering society. And we opened the flag up and we took a look at it, and I took a good look at it for the first time, and I said to myself, the man's got a great point, and I've been working to change it ever since. And the fact that, thank you, Karen, the fact that, now I'm blushing and embarrassed, so I have to think about what I was just about to say.
State flag.
The state flag, and I took a good look at it, and I've been working on it ever since. And the fact that I had 20 years experience as a town meeting member taught me that town meeting, the most democratic forum in our country today, the northeastern states that allow 10 citizens to bring any issue forward and open doors to everybody in the community to come ask their questions, get answers to their questions, and then take a vote. This is an extremely powerful way to influence state policy. So we began with 4 towns in my little neck of the woods: Gill, Wendell, New Salem, and the town of Orange, which just a year earlier had voted in favor of Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton, not a progressive bastion, not a Cambridge or a Provincetown. We won the vote in all 4 of those towns. And the larger daily, not my little weekly newspaper, the larger daily newspaper in Franklin County, which is, you know, this most rural county in the Commonwealth, admittedly, but still, we think our votes are important there too. Called me and interviewed me and said, now that you've had 4 towns vote to do this, you know, what's your next step? And I said, well, I think 4 towns should probably be enough. You know, the governor, the legislature should take a look at that and say 4 towns in our neck of the, you know, Franklin County have voted to change this. That really should do it. When towns are standing up and voicing this protest, the state should listen. And then I made the mistake of saying, but if they don't change it, we'll just keep getting more towns and more towns and more cities to vote on it until we finally do win this struggle. And so that was 2018, and now here we are with 81 cities and towns having voted in favor of changing it, and only 7 so far of all the towns that have voted on this. Only 7 have said no. One of them is in Franklin County, and we're going back for a revote in the little town of Hawley and hope we can win that. We only lost it by 3 votes. So it's a democratic process. It's a grassroots process. And you are suddenly at the forefront of it here in Wayland. Let's take a look at the history of the seal. This is what the state seal first represented when the Puritans brought it over. It was created in 1629, the year before the Puritans sailed. So it was created as sort of their imagined idea of what they would find when they got to what was called Shawmut Bay, and it's now called Boston Harbor. And they thought, perhaps, that Native people wore loincloths of leaves. No one who has, you know, stepped foot on this continent would have come up with this kind of caricature of what Native dress might look like. But this was the Puritans' image, and this was our state seal at the time that we were a chartered colony of the Crown. You'll see a downward pointed arrow and no quiver of arrows on the Indigenous figure's shoulder, because this was not meant to represent a warlike, ready for battle Native person. The downward pointed arrow, according to the literature and the lore, was meant to represent peaceful Native or a pacified Native. Here's the speech balloon that really gives away terribly racist roots of our state symbol come over and help us, as if the benefits of civilization were about to flow toward the indigenous people, or the benefits of Christianity perhaps were about to be offered to the native people. But in fact, maybe it was a translation error, and it should have said, come over and help yourself to our land. That might have been what it should have said. Anyway, this was our symbol from 1629 to 1684, when the Crown revoked the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Company. Let's go to the next slide. And a series of royal governors came in person to rule the colony of Massachusetts. And the first one was Governor Andros. There were 12 more after that. But each one of them is interesting to look at. I'm only going to show you the first of the royal seals of Massachusetts. Here again, you see this idealized version of, sort of a Eurocentric point of view of what the indigenous people's relationship to the crown might be, how grateful they are, offering the fruits of their harvest, when in fact, this was within 10 years of the decimation of the tribal nations of this area in that war that I mentioned. And at that time, families of indigenous people were being broken up. People were being sold into slavery, not only in Boston, Providence, or the whaling town of New London, where I grew up in Connecticut, where indigenous slavery was common, but mostly indigenous slaves were forced overseas, mostly to the West Indies, but as far away as Africa. But to the West Indies mainly, they were shipped, and to the particularly brutal conditions of the sugar plantations in places like Barbados, where the mortality rate for the workers who were forced to do that labor was 25% per annum, according to the people who have researched it. So they were hardly the grateful subjects pictured here. In fact, they were being hunted down and enslaved. Rebellion occurred, of course, over taxation without representation, the principle first enunciated in the Magna Carta. And at the time of the revolutionary outbreak in Boston, the last royal governor and his seal were ejected, and the revolutionary governor, whose name I'm just suddenly forgetting, the most famous revolutionary figure of Massachusetts at the time. Anyway, he commissioned Paul Revere to come up with a new symbol for the colony that was in revolt at that time, Massachusetts, in the midst of the Revolutionary War. And this is Paul Revere's effort, and a suitable one for the time, with a Minuteman bearing a sword and the Magna Carta, a quiver, and a bow. And now, instead of a speech balloon saying, please come over and help us, we have a Latin motto saying, essentially, the translation of this most commonly is, she seeks a quiet peace under the sword, but peace with liberty. And peace and liberty were never in much evidence for the native people of this land, of this part of the continent at that time. Let's move to the next slide. It was rendered in many different versions. This is a particularly frightening one, I think, where you have this heavily armored hand and sword, much larger in relationship to the native person. But you see this almost at the whim of the artist at the time. The main features change, even which hand is holding the bow, which hand is holding the arrow, until 1890, when the Secretary of State at that time, a man named William Olin, decided enough artistic freedom. We're going to nail this down in such a way that it will be codified by the legislature, and it's not going to change again. So let's see what it looks like today and what it's looked like ever since 1890. The same features, but this is now our state symbol, and our state seal is our state flag. And this symbol is taught, as part of the core curriculum at the 3rd grade level in social studies class to all our public school students, regardless of race. And it's a pretty difficult thing, I think, for a young student. I often think about it in terms of what an elementary school child sees and asks their teacher to explain when they see this. But this sword, William Olin directed his illustrator, a man named Edmund Garrett. Let's just go on to the exploded view in the next slide. He asked that, in particular, the sword that is kept in the Pilgrim Hall in Plymouth be used as the model for the broadsword. And that sword was carried by the military commander of the Plymouth colony, a man named Miles Standish. And I'm just going to read you a little bit from what Faries Gray, who would have been the opening speaker, the main speaker tonight, I would have just been backing him up if he could have made it. But he was quoted in a statewide article that appeared in papers in my neck of the woods and all across the state at the beginning of this year. And Faries says this: "The sword needs to go," he said. "I think that's pretty universal. Everyone agrees about the sword." After allegedly hearing a warning of a potential attack, Miles Standish called for, quote, "a peaceful summit with Massachusett, Sagamore, Pecksuot, and Withawamet, as well as several others. During what is now known as the massacre at Wassagusset, Standish poisoned or ambushed and killed them, beheading one warrior and displaying his head on a post in Plymouth, actually, as a warning, according to tribal history." And it's not just tribal history. You can look it up in any history book of Massachusetts, the Wassagusset Massacre. "For the Massachusett Tribe," says Faries Gray, "when we see this flag and we see this sword, we view this as they're honoring a terrorist, which is insane," he said. "We just want the truth to be told about the genocide that happened here." So it is particularly insulting, offensive, egregious, harmful that that sword, placed in relationship to the Indigenous person in a way that certainly looks threatening from a child's viewpoint. It almost looks poised to strike. And in fact, the illustrator spent quite a long bit of research time contacting armorers in Europe before he felt like he knew exactly how the hand should grip the handle of the sword. The French said we would be gripping it in such a way where the thumb would be extended along the hilts because we thrust the sword in battle. But the English predecessors, Miles Standish representing them, would have gripped it as it's shown here because they use it to chop in battle. So he wanted to make sure he had it just so. Quickly, I'm going to mention something that is actually of considerable local historical interest, is that among all the other elements of this image, of this symbolism, we have the bow, and Edmund Garrett, the illustrator, particularly chose a bow from a native person who was shot and killed in 1665 in Sudbury, at a time when Wayland, I believe, was still part of Sudbury. The settler's name we know, William Goodnow. Maybe there's a library named after him. But we've lost to history the name of the native person whose bow we have been teaching our children and looking at in our state symbol ever since 1890. So that's just another way that native imagery is taken, used without regard, without consultation for the feelings or the sensitivities of the native people. And they almost become invisible. Their names are forgotten. The facial features, for example, were taken from an Indian, I'm sorry, I'm using the terminology of the settlers, from an indigenous leader from Montana, a Chippewa chief whose name was Little Shell. And the illustrator felt like, quote, this is a fine specimen of an Indian for the Massachusetts symbol, even though there's absolutely no relationship between the photograph from Montana of a particular chief and the Massachusetts Indigenous nations. This belt he patterned after a red flannel belt, which was believed to be worn by King Philip in battle, Metacom, the second son of Husamiquin, who we call the Massachusett. That belt is still held at the Peabody Museum in Cambridge. And for those of you who know this gruesome history, Metacom was killed in battle in Mount Hope, Rhode Island. His body was drawn and quartered. One hand was sent to the King of England, and his head was also put on a stake to rot for 20 years, more than 20 years in what we now call Plymouth. And you can go to Plymouth right in front of their court square, and there's a plaque there mentioning these horrible details. But when Indigenous people put this together, as they, of course, will, that the symbol of King Philip is here and the symbol of Miles Standish's sword is here, this really reeks of a history of violence and genocide. Anything else about this that I haven't mentioned? Oh, of course, that as if Native people have skeletal structures different from other races, Edmund Garrett took a skeleton of a Native person that had been dug up and kept in a private museum in Winthrop, and used that to make sure he had the bodily proportions accurate. Think about that just for a moment. The whole thing is a sort of a Frankenstein image put together from body parts, battle arms taken from people whose names we have forgotten or disinterred or kept in museums. It is not an image that anyone could construe as an honor to Indigenous people. And we should think carefully about the fact that we're continuing to teach this in grade schools year after year. Next to last slide, please. Here's Faries Gray at last. He made it. Here he is. He's the Sagamore of the Massachusett Tribe at Ponkapoag, who are the living culture of the people who the Puritans first encountered with their idealized image of coming over to help them. So Faries, I wish you were here tonight, but this is where he was in November of 2019, I believe, in front of the State House, calling for it's time to change the flag and seal. And this is not a man who you would expect to cry easily in public, but when I went into that hearing room with him and with hundreds of other people from all over the Commonwealth, calling on the legislature and talking to the representatives of the legislature under this huge image of a settler's sword above the head of an Indigenous person, which is all over the State House. Faries talked about the history that I just quoted here, about how this sword was used against his people, and he was in tears, and so were many of us. Last slide, please. So here's what my work has been, really, to bring this kind of information, which is written down in the history books, kept in the state archives, kept in the special collections room at the State House, and which the illustrator, Edmund Garrett, was proud enough to publish in a regional magazine called the New England Quarterly in 1900, saying that he knew little, I'm going to paraphrase him, he knew little about the Indigenous people whose figure he represented in that symbol, but he understands that their reputation is very poor. among those who do know him, quote unquote. Well, paraphrasing him. The actual quote that I always mention is that he called them poor savages in that story in 1900 and felt confident that his audience would not blink at that terminology. In any case, we have gone from town to town, from the Berkshires to the tip of Cape Cod, and we have had the discussion in towns which might be considered extremely liberal, like Provincetown, like, you know, some of the towns in my neighborhood, like Amherst and Leverett, and in towns that voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump in the last two elections, like, which might be an indication that they're not the most liberal communities. And we've lost some of those votes so closely in North Brookfield, for example, which was the town that voted in favor of Donald Trump, the second most per capita or percentage-wise of any town in the state. We lost that vote so closely in North Brookfield last year that the moderator had to call for a standing count. Couldn't even tell, because I'm just going to tell you this one little anecdote about that meeting in North Brookfield. The conversations are what is important. The conversation at town meetings sometimes is so powerful. A man stood up and said, I've been coming to the town meeting here in North Brookfield ever since I moved here 10 or 15 years ago, and I've never spoken before. And I never would have imagined that this would have been the issue that would have brought me to my feet and to speak to you. But I'm a historian, he said, and there is so much in Massachusetts history that we should be proud of, but the military conquest of Native people is not one of them. And he almost won the day with that speech. We've lost 7 of these votes, and we've won 81, including the 2 most recent in Hamilton about 2 weeks ago, where the vote was 79-12, I believe, and I'm sorry, Wenham and Hamilton. Hamilton was the one where we won it by 4-1. It was something like 390 to 110. And the next town to vote is Wayland. And why is this important right now? I'll just summarize extremely quickly to say that after the state legislature had been considering a bill brought up by a great African-American legislator named Byron Rushing in 1985, he first introduced a bill in cooperation with the Commission on Indian Affairs, and the leader of that commission at that time was John Slow Turtle Peters from the Mashpee Wampanoag, who passed away in office as the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for Massachusetts, and now his son has inherited that role, and his son is still waiting for his father's work to be recognized and changing the flag and seal. John Slow Turtle Peters and Byron Rushing introduced a bill in 1985 to set up a special commission to study the history, which we've just gone through, and the imagery, the details of the symbolism of our state flag, and to recommend changes to it. And the legislature had that bill in front of them for 36 years in a row, 17 consecutive sessions, before, as I mentioned, right here, a few towns began voting and then other towns picked it up. And finally, in 2020, the state Senate voted unanimously to set up that special commission. And coincidentally, on the morning of the day that lives in infamy as the January 6th riot in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol, that day at about 4 o'clock in the morning, the state House of Representatives overwhelmingly supported what the Senate had already unanimously voted, and a special commission was formed. Governor Baker delayed on the appointment of the members of that commission for 10 months until the original deadline for the commission had already come and gone to make their report back to the legislature. Governor Baker didn't consider it a high priority. But eventually that commission was seated with 19 members, 6 of whom were leaders of Indigenous nations of the Commonwealth. And by leaders, I mean tribal chairman of the Mashpee Wampanoag, tribal chairwoman of the Kinnawampanoag, the Nipmuc Center representative, and Faries Gray is one of the elders of his tribal council. Elizabeth Solomon was also on that commission. So for the first time, and this is historic and wonderful news, the legislature actually consulted with Native people about the use of their imagery. And in May of 2022, the 19-member commission, which included the Secretary of State's representative and the head of the Mass Historical Society, not easy people to convince, voted unanimously that this symbol was causing harm today to the residents of the Commonwealth and needs to be totally revised. And that commission issued its final report in November of last year without coming to a decision about what a new image should look like, which is a healthy discussion that needs to be completed. But they laid out steps for how to get us there, and that is where we are today. And so Hamilton and Wenham were the first two town meetings to weigh in since that special commission issued its report. And Wayland is going to be the next. So this is very, very important. It's a critical time to push our governor, in particular, Governor Healy, who ran on issues of equity and inclusion, and who made statements in her inaugural address that systemic barriers of racism can and should and will be removed. It's time, Governor Healy, for you to notice that almost a quarter of the cities and towns in the Commonwealth have voted to change this inherently violent symbol of genocide. It's time to change the flag and seal. So I'll stop there and answer any questions I can from the audience here. Thank you so much for coming out on a nice spring evening to talk about this painful history. Right.
Thank you. Questions?
Hi, everyone. How many towns or communities do you think are, or do you know, are necessary in order to push Healy and anybody else who needs pushing over the finish line here?
I cannot say that I had ever expected that it would take this many to bring that long-awaited change to occur. But I think we need to keep working at this until we succeed. And if that means going to every single one of the 351 cities and towns, at some point, the legislature is going to be pretty embarrassed if all the cities and towns that they represent say, this is a horrible symbol, please get rid of it. I don't think it's going to take that many, but we're already at 24% of the communities. You'll notice that it doesn't include Boston, and we should easily win that vote in Boston. There's been discussions about that for quite some time, when that will take place. That's a city council decision and a city council vote. The Human Rights Commission in Boston just voted to change it a few months ago. We've not brought it to Worcester, although there's discussions about doing that. It's a little harder to bring it up to a city council than it is to a town meeting. Annual town meetings, 10 signatures, you get a vote. City council, you really have to work. So I don't know the answer, but when you look at this map, you'll see that towns in your immediate neighborhood, of course, Lincoln was one of the very first to vote to change it, but we haven't found the person to gather 10 signatures in Concord, for example, where it would pass easily. So leaving here tonight, if you'll stay in touch with us, and the Change the Mass Flag website is at the bottom of the flyer, and you know friends in any of these communities nearby who might be able to help us next year if we're still working at this. And I hope we're not, but if we are, mostly all it takes is one person or one faith-based group in a church, a committee at a Unitarian church or synagogue or anywhere, to say, my town's not on record and it should be. All you need is one person to gather 10 signatures, and then I'll come out and give the talk I just gave to you. And I think that's the way we have to keep working at this. And did, yes, sir.
It's a very small detail, but why do you can imagine for several hundred years, they felt they had to have this image of a sword hanging over the top of it went through every one of the things that you showed, basically.
Yes.
What was the motivation for that?
You want to repeat the question, maybe for the online people?
Oh, I'm typing it in the chat for them.
Why a sword? And when you look at the other 50 state flags and seals, there are very few that show this kind of battle-ready imagery. Why did Massachusetts go in this direction? In the immediate aftermath of the Revolutionary War, there was one person who was delegated the responsibility of coming up with what our permanent seal and image should be. And he left no notes that I could find, and I've searched. His only reference to Native people was, he said something like, William Cushing said something like, the savages in the woods. You know, basically this was a period of armed struggle to dispossess the Native people of their lands. Sometimes people say, well, this sword is a symbol of the struggle against England, you know, the successful revolutionary struggle against England. But colonial broadswords were not used at that time. They hadn't been in use in battle for more than 100 years. Even when the Pilgrims came over, they were rarely used in battle any longer. So if people say, well, that sword represents the struggle against England, I think not. I think, of course, there's a direct relation with the motto of our state, peace under the sword. You need the sword in order for the motto to make any sense. But it's a very, very ancient and troubling image of violence. And I think what we're really looking for in a state that has grown increasingly diverse, wonderfully diverse, is an image that can talk about what unites us all, not an image of past division and past violence. I don't know if I can answer your question better than that, because the person who chose it left no notes as to why.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm confused on the technicalities. So they appointed the commission, it did its work, it did its report.
Yeah.
And why does every town have to vote on it?
Every town doesn't have to vote on it. The towns could remain quiet and continue to fly the flag. Towns are forced to fly the flag as part of state law. You have to have it in your school buildings. You have to have it in your town hall. So it affects and touches each and every one of our towns. When you go into town meeting on Monday, May 13th, you'll most likely, almost 90% or 99% of the time, it'll be right there on the stage. And when the article comes up, Article 17, my recommendation would be someone just should go up there and open it, because it'll be the first time a lot of the people voting on it will have ever really looked at this. This is our flag. It's on the side of every state patrol car. It's on every bridge abutment, mostly across the Commonwealth. It is on a shoulder patch on the state trooper. It's on the dais of the courtroom when you go in to seek justice. It is on the diploma that is issued by the University of Massachusetts in all its locations to all its students, including Indigenous students. And my friend Brittany Wally from the NITHPO says, who's just graduated from one of these state universities, says, I have to hang this on my wall and be proud of this for the rest of my life of my academic achievement, a white hand holding a sword over my head. Think about how this impacts people. It doesn't require the vote of 81 or 82 towns to convince the governor or the secretary of the Commonwealth that this is an image that we need to relegate to history. We're not going to change the bridge abutments. We're not going to take the stained glass image of it down from the rotunda at the State House. We're going to look at that and teach our children this is what we used to consider to be an appropriate symbol, but here's the new one. So how will we ever reach that day? Like I said, the legislature was
pleased to ignore this whole issue for 36 years, despite the fact that it was being brought to them by an African-American legislator and a Native American leader for 36 years in a row. They were just happy to ignore it, I think. Until towns began to stand up and say, we don't want to fly this flag any longer. I'll just stop there. Yeah.
So to this technical question,
Yeah.
another way to build on it, or maybe restate what you were saying is, so the vote at town meetings around the state is to basically to encourage our state legislators to prioritize this. So that right, so that the
Absolutely.
committee has decided, yes, it should be changed.
Yep.
But now there's no more action, like nothing's happening. So the vote is to say to our state senators and representatives,
Absolutely.
can you please prioritize this?
Absolutely. And you know you're in good company with nearly a quarter of the towns and cities who've asked their state senators and representatives to prioritize
So that's
this.
the ask. I think you
Yeah.
might have been asking,
Yeah.
what's the ask? And
Yeah.
I think that's the ask.
So just one final point on the special commission. You've invited for the first time in 400 years Native leaders to consult. They've told you and unanimously, this is offensive to us, please change it. And now, if we ignore that and leave that study, that special commission report on a shelf gathering dust, what are we really saying to the 92,000 Indigenous people who still call Massachusetts home, and all the Indigenous scholars who come here to study? And actually to the world at large who, fly into Logan Airport, and this is the first image of Massachusetts they see. What are we saying when we say, well, we consulted with Native leaders, the tribal chairman, and they all said, change it, and we're not going to change it. That's unacceptable. And, towns have every right to stand up and say, that's unacceptable, please change it. Yes.
So I know a lot about state government. I'm gonna warn you ahead of time, okay, and I read this report, and my understanding was that exactly as it says here, the Secretary of the Commonwealth has been charged with forming a working group, right?
Yes, you're right.
So you keep mentioning it's Maura Healey. I actually do not think that it's Maura Healey. I think that it's Bill Galvin's office that is supposed to do that, right?
So I'll
And
tell you a
he
story.
is not under.
Yeah.
I think everybody should be very clear about the fact the Secretary of the Commonwealth does not work under the government. They are separately elected and separate mandates. So tell me why you're saying that it needs to be Maura Healey.
Well, I think that Maura Healey's voice would be very powerful if she would raise it right now on this issue. It's true that the special commission called upon Secretary Galvin to form a small working group. They outlined who should be on it. It should have an Indigenous co-chair, and they should just hire a designer, come to agreement about what the new flag and seal should look like, and create the new image. That's what the special commission's final report asked Galvin to do. So my senator, Jo Comerford, who's a huge supporter of this, and I know she wasn't alone, she went in with Jason Lewis. Who does he represent? Nearby towns.
Like Medford,
Yeah.
Melrose.
Oh, no, well, we have Jamie Eldridge, I know.
So Jason Lewis and Jo Comerford, two senators who are tremendous proponents of changing the flag, went and after weeks of asking for a meeting with Secretary Galvin, finally got in the door at the secretary's office. He wouldn't meet with them directly. He delegated some staff person to meet with them, who told them basically the secretary is not interested in this. We're not going to do anything. This was in December or January, just a few months ago. So there's that. This is Secretary Galvin, who's elected independently statewide, doesn't have to respond to anything the legislature tells him or the governor. And he had 2 representatives on the special commission, 2 out of 19, and they both voted in favor of changing it and asking him to do the final work to change it. So his own representatives told him, and he ignores that too. So my hope is not that we put a whole lot of pressure on Galvin and he's suddenly going to change his mind, but believe me, hundreds and hundreds of people have been writing to his office and to him as well, and sending them copies of their town meeting votes saying we're waiting. So we're not ignoring the fact that This is on Galvin's shoulders at the moment. But in other states where this has been done recently, and I look at Mississippi, because we always said we're in a race to the bottom with Mississippi, who had the image of the Confederate battle flag as the last state still flying that as their state flag and teaching that to their students. The governor stood up at one point after the murder of George Floyd. It took 20 years of discussion in Mississippi, referendums, they wouldn't budge. But after the murder of George Floyd, people started canceling, their bookings at convention centers in Mississippi and saying, we're not going to come spend money in your state if you continue to fly this flag. So the governor stood up and said, 3 months from now, we will have a new flag. Okay. And that put everybody on notice, and the legislature got it done. And they have a beautiful new magnolia flag in consultation with tribal nations like the Biloxi. In Minnesota, the governor has spoken on the changing of their state symbol, which shows a Native American on horseback vanishing into the sunset while a settler comes along with a plow to plow the new land. And the lieutenant governor is Indigenous in Minnesota, and she refused to continue to use that as part of her office and her stationery. So, Lieutenant Governor, Governor Healy, they have a voice and they should speak. They should look around and see how broadly supported they would be when so many cities and towns have said, please do this. Finally, the legislature can act, regardless of whether Secretary Galvin just decides I'm in my last term, I'm never going to run again. I don't want to have this on my resume as the guy who changed the flag and seal. I don't know what he's thinking. But we're writing to him, senators are talking to him. I still say that it's the grassroots energy from concerned people like yourselves, from concerned faith-based groups, racial justice organizations, taking a look at this and saying, this is grossly offensive and it needs to change. It's the grassroots energy that's going to make that happen. I believe that.
There's just one more question and a comment online. The question is about the star on the flag. Do you know if that has any
Good question.
significance?
The star simply indicates that this is one of the original 13 colonies to become the original 13 states. And it's an unusual star in the number of points that it has. I forget how many. 5, is that right? But it's almost like an afterthought compared to the central imagery, which we've traced the lineage back to 1629. The star got stamped in there right after the Revolutionary War to say we're one of the successful revolutionary colonies.
And the comment is from Professor John Childs. He says, as a Boston Roxbury born enrolled member of the Massachusett Tribe at Ponkapoag, I thank you for your positive efforts. I will add that the Massachusett Tribe is today thriving and engaged in language and cultural renewal through the amazing work of its Sagamores and all of our people. Kuta Putush, thank you.
Oh my goodness, that's so wonderful. Please, if there's a way to extend thanks back to that speaker, it's wonderful that we got that comment tonight. And thank you all for coming and the important work ahead. 2 weeks from now, town meeting is a little like theater sometimes. And if you stand up and speak and someone speaks against you, sometimes it's the last person's voice that moves the undecided members of the crowd. So please take the information that you've brought with you in the form of the flyers and from whatever you've learned here tonight, and talk to your friends and neighbors, and please go to that meeting and exercise your democratic voice. Very, very important right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.